Broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
All right, welcome everyone. Thank you again for joining us for today's webinar, the third in our series of sessions that we've been hosting over the summer to kind of get us more oriented towards this idea of patient engagement in research. So today's session we have titled, or we're exploring more specifically about how patient engagement can be incorporated into a research project. And we'll kind of get a sense of what that involvement would look like throughout the research process. But however, as we get started today, it's important to note that today's session will run a bit differently compared to what we've done before. So there are just a few housekeeping items to get across. We are going to be engaging you in a few more interactive elements where in the past we've had some polls where you have provided feedback. So we will still incorporate that to a degree today, but we will also hope to take advantage of the webinar platform's ability to discuss and be more interactive with each other. So if you take a look at your at the control panel that you have on your screen, in order for you to participate in a discussion or ask a question, you want to click that raise your hand icon that is located in the panel. And throughout the session, some of the discussion queries will be marked, and we ask that if you have any questions, that you just take note of those so that we can have time at the end to relay and hopefully further discuss any of those points that you raise. Alternatively, if you don't want to go on your microphone, you can also use the question box to type your input, or even the chat box to respond to any inquiries, and we'll try to read those out as they come in and if time permits. So for today's session, we intend to convey three main learning objectives. The first is to define some of the guiding principles that are crucial for soliciting patient engagement in the research process. We want to briefly review the life cycle of a research project and ultimately use that to appreciate how patient partners can meaningfully and effectively contribute at various stages throughout that process. And thirdly, we are going to look at or briefly consider some published work that has been done in the field and gauge where, at this point, we've seen patient engagement be incorporated within a research project. So if you've joined us in any of the previous sessions this summer, you probably have seen the slide a few times. As always, we like to just get a sense of who is all on online, so we can get a sense of the perspectives that each of you all bring. So before, we used to link out to another website to have you input your data, but today we'll just do this internal to the webinar platform. So in a moment, I will activate a poll, and then you should be able to just click the stakeholder group that you most commonly identify with. So I'll give you a few moments to fill that out, and it should be live on your on your screen right now. So I'll give you about 30 seconds, and then we will review what our results look like. All right, that looks like we grabbed everyone. So let's see if we can get this on your screen. All right, so it looks like the vast majority of our attendees today are healthcare providers or researchers or trainees, so that's really great. And it looks like we also have a nice representation of youth, patient partners, and some other stakeholders, which I would assume are some folks who are involved with the ministries and engaged in health care in some fashion. So I hope you all keep that in mind as we go on today, since we hope to get a bit more of your input and explore some of the various perspectives that you will bring as we go on. Anyway, I should. So during our previous session, so we'll just quickly review some of the previous sessions we have had, and we've ultimately introduced this idea of Canada's strategy for patient-oriented research, or SPORE. And in the sessions, we have defined patient-oriented research as research that focuses on patient-identified priorities. And we've recognized that patient-oriented research moves away from a model of patients exclusively as subjects and strives to engage patients as partners throughout the research process. This ultimately requires that patient partners be engaged in a meaningful and active manner throughout a research project. And this ideally would be from study startup to closeout, and ultimately translating that knowledge into effective policy and alternative interventions. And lastly, we've recognized that Canadian health research has a global reputation for excellence. But despite this quality, Canada faces a challenge in turning all of this wonderful information into high quality and cost-effective care. Thus, a third defining feature of patient-oriented research is that it ultimately aims to apply knowledge generated from research to improve healthcare systems and the associated practices. So in Chalbright, patient engagement strives towards the authentic and active involvement of patient partners in the governance of how the network is run, in setting priorities of the research projects, in various capacities contribute to the process of conducting research, and lastly, contributing their perspective in helping incorporate the research outcomes and translate these into what we were just mentioning, into effective policy change and intervention. So next we need to consider what cardinal features must be in place to facilitate the authentic and active involvement of patient partners throughout the research process. Now, to answer this question, right at the start, when the strategy of patient-oriented research was being considered, a workshop was hosted in Ottawa in around 2014, I believe. And ultimately, this workshop had brought together patients and a variety of engagement experts from around Canada. With the goal of this meeting being to define some core guiding principles that would effectively facilitate patient engagement in research. So these principles that were developed at this workshop are ultimately integral to the patient engagement framework that CIHR has produced through the SPORE initiative. And ultimately, these principles include, firstly, inclusiveness. And that speaks to the idea that engagement in research strives to integrate a diversity of patients' perspectives, as well as those of the researchers. And the work ultimately that is considered is reflective of their contribution. Integral again, and another guiding principle for effective patient engagement is this idea of support. And it's clear that adequate support and flexibility is needed to adapt the way that research is done to allow patient participants to fully contribute to discussions and decisions that are made. And really what this implies is that there is mechanisms and strategies put in place to ensure safety, confidentiality, cultural competence, and an array of training and educational materials, or I guess modules, that help to support this engagement of, or that would allow this engagement of patients throughout the research process. Thirdly, the idea of mutual respect. It's crucial that research practitioners and patients acknowledge each other's expertise and acknowledge that their experiential knowledge and the background that each of these groups bring can together synergistically create something that is greater than if these were just to remain in solidarity. And lastly, another core guiding principle for patient engagement is this idea of co-building, where partnerships between patients, researchers, and any other SPORE stakeholders, such as your policymakers, would mean working together right from the start to identify the problems and gaps and relay that into setting priorities for the research projects, and then ultimately continue that relationship throughout the process and work together to implement the eventual outcomes that are derived. Now, in order for us to all just be on the same page, we'll briefly consider how a research project unfolds. And so really, we're just doing this to sort of enhance the ensuing discussions that we will have in a moment. And so really, we're just going to spend a few moments to detail the typical path or life cycle of a research project. Now, I recognize, because we have such a large contingent of researchers in the audience, this would be quite generic, but it'll be good just to review and keep us all on the same page. So here we have the typical representation of the research process. It ideally begins at the problem identification step, and as it's represented here, apparently it appears that it would then go through this process in a somewhat linear fashion, with the end goal being publishing your work and ultimately affecting policy in some way, or affecting practice in some way. So back at the problem identification stage, once you have identified that problem, the next step is to develop a plan of action. And ultimately, what this involves is gathering information about what is already known about the problem that you are considering, setting your research objectives, establishing how you will measure these outcomes, and ultimately examine the feasibility of the project that you are proposing. All this work eventually feeds into developing your grant proposal, and if you're lucky enough to get funded, you can move to the next stage and start to prepare for launching your research project. What this typically involves is that you recruit study participants, ensure that all your regulatory requirements, such as your ethics approvals or collaborative agreements with other institutions, are put into place and put into effect. Once your study has started, you get into the critical part of a research project, where you start to collect your data that you need in order to answer the original research question that you had put forward in your application. This data ultimately is, once it is collected, it's analyzed and used to inform the conclusions that are generated. Once these conclusions are formed, the next step for you is to communicate your findings. This typically is through attending research conferences or publishing the work in a peer-reviewed journal. And really the goal here is to communicate your findings to a wider community, with the ultimate goal being to have this translate into changes that are implemented either through policy or introducing a new intervention that would be more effective than what is currently available. Now, although this infographic applies that, as we mentioned before, it implies that research progresses in a linear fashion. The reality is that once a project gets started, it can become a rather iterative process. Like any other workplace, things are generally not as clear as they initially appear to be. So if you are involved in a project that doesn't really seem to be going down this path in this way, that's okay. Because that's really just the reality of research. So, however, the value of looking at research through this model is that it gives us a sense of the various stages that are involved, that are needed to answer any specific question. Before we move on, of course, it's critical to just stress that one key aspect is that research takes time. Because this is a slow process, team building is vital to success, and this is of a critical importance with this idea of incorporating patient partners throughout the research process. So ultimately, input from all team members throughout the research project is valuable and is important wherever and whenever it's possible to accommodate that. So let's just simplify that model a bit. So we are going to just break down these 8 stages into sort of 3 phases, so that it's a bit easier for us to just refer to these aspects. So we will break our model into the preparatory phase, which is sort of the startup, where you run through those initial facets of getting ready for a study. Well, then that would feed into the execution phase, where you start the work, collect the data, and ultimately that feeds into the translation phase, where your research project, the data is collected, analyzed, and then communicated to that wider audience that we were referring to earlier. All right, so now we're going to kick it back to all of you again. So in the ensuing slides, we will have a few multiple choice prompts that pop up again, and later on a few discussion questions that would be that we put on you again to sort of explore some of the aspects that we need to be considering when we talk about patient engagement in the research process. So, taking into account these 3 phases that we were just sort of defining, at what research phase do you think patient partners and researchers can work together effectively? So I will get that poll started for you. And so that is on your screen as of right now. So yes, just take a moment, reflect on that, and think about where that engagement or that collaboration can occur. All right, so that looks like we have received a large majority of the responses. So let me share that one with you. So as you can see, we had quite a significant uptake in each of the phases. So that I think is encouraging. And as we go forward, we will consider perhaps some of the challenges that are inherent with incorporating the patient perspective at some of these stages, or I guess the initial perception of challenges. And as we review the published work that we had circulated to you, it's clear that perhaps at the preparatory phase, that has always been the aspect of research where patient input has been more easily, or patient participation has been more easily incorporated or reflected. But as we adopt this strategy of patient-oriented research, we really want to move forward towards the idea of fully and meaningfully engaging patient partners throughout all of these phases. Not to say that it's easy, it's definitely going to be challenging, but as this process evolves and as we learn more about how to do this more effectively and efficiently, I believe that barrier ultimately will diminish. All right. So our next question, which I guess is sort of related to the previous one, in your opinion, which phase do you think would be the easiest, would contain the easiest stage for patient involvement to occur? All right, so based on your input, I think we definitely had a clear preference for the preparatory stages of the research process as being the easiest to incorporate the patient perspective. And second to that would be the translation stage. And I think inherently the ease at which those are implemented is quite common. And going forward, which is perhaps we will chat about in the next slide, is looking at that execution stage and figuring out why that is so challenging and what sort of strategies can be adopted to better reflect the patient experience or perspective within that phase. So our next question then, I guess we can pick up on the poll results from the last one. So I won't release the poll again, but perhaps we'll just ask the question directly to the researchers in the audience. What phase of the research cycle do you think would be the most challenging to engage patients? And if so, why? So clearly from the previous poll we had circulated, it definitely was the execution phase that was most challenging. And really, it'd be great if everyone can sort of get a perspective on what the thoughts are as to why why that would be, and perhaps even some comments on what sort of strategies can be incorporated. So in your panel, again, let me remind you of the raise your hand feature. So if you want to raise your hand, we'll definitely unmute your mic, and we'll be happy to have you comment in and have all the other participants further contribute to the discussion. All right, sorry, so it looks like we have. Yes, so we will, sorry, so we just got a question asking whether we will release the slides. Yes, all attendees will be provided with the slide deck once we release a recording either today or tomorrow. All right, so Matthew, you have your hand up. We will release the microphone to you in just a moment, and then yeah, feel free to comment, and then I will try to look at the submitted questions that were typed in and see if we can contribute to the discussion that way. All right, Matthew, your microphone is active, so feel free to comment.
So I think the execution phase can be very difficult just because in terms of knowledge and ability to do research, sometimes some of the stakeholders may not have as much active knowledge of that. So you almost would need some sort of engagement in terms of training as well, which seems to suggest that perhaps we would need to put a little bit more effort in this stage. Although I would say this stage is very important because findings and numbers and how we look at those could get a lot of help from them.
Right, Matthew. Yeah, and I think that you raise a great point there in that if we are going to, or if this way of doing research is better and has a demonstrable effect on the type of research that is done and the effectiveness of that work, it definitely is critical that patient partners are fully activated, that they are given the ability to fully and meaningfully be engaged. And I think, yes, definitely having more training resources and training programs out there to, I guess, get everyone up to speed and on the same page is of crucial importance. So our next question is from KBHN. Go away. Oh, go ahead.
Oh, that's me. Hi, my name's Doug Swanson. I'm the research training manager for Kids Brain Health. But you know, I submitted a quick question in relation to the preparatory phase. You know, that's a time before you submit your grant or submit and receive a grant. Yet we want to engage individuals in this at that phase without funds, and I'm wondering if that's a barrier. Both on the researcher side as well as potentially on the patient participant side.
Great question. Thank you, Doug. And yes, no, that is a critical barrier to the way that this approach goes towards research. And really, for this type of work to gain traction, the funding model needs to change. So we need to have funds available to explore that startup phase to get yourself oriented and get you set up. And that's sort of how ChildBright actually got into existence, was through a limited grant that was made available to get stakeholders together to identify those research priorities, and then ultimately have that be the ultimately have that give fruition to the grant application that was submitted. So yes, that's crucially important, and it is going to require a lot more top-down changes, I guess, where if the strategy is more effective, is more efficient, to have funding agencies enable that startup phase where you are able to engage with all relevant stakeholder groups to identify those priorities and get set up. All right.
Thanks.
Thank you, Doug. Right, Sonia, we see that you have your hand up, but it doesn't seem like we can unmute you. Give us a second. Okay, so all right. So we, if you are able to check your email or your phone, we did just send you an audio pin. So if you could sign in, we could unmute you and get your comment. If not, feel free to type it in the discussion box, and we will try to get back to you that way. So anyone else? Any other thoughts? Does anyone? So I think an issue that comes up for me all the time is how can patient partners effectively contribute to the stage of collecting and analyzing data? As because I feel that is certainly a stage of the research process where seeing the benefit of patient participation may be challenging. So I'm just wondering if anyone on the call has had experience with thinking about that problem or coming up with any sort of strategy to facilitate that engagement at that stage. All right. Yeah, so that's a challenging question. I get it, and hopefully, as this process evolves, we will be able to more meaningfully and effectively look at that stage, or look at all these stages together, and figure out how we can more collaboratively work together. All right. So on the flip side, then let's engage the patient partners or youth that we have on the line, and essentially ask you the same question. What phase of the research project do you think would be most challenging to be engaged in, and why? So again, raise your hand. If not, we'll try to grab your question in the question panel, or your comment in the question panel. All right, so we did have a few comments come in at the through the question or the chat box, and some of you were agreeing that the execution phase is perhaps the most challenging. Oh no, I lost my point. Oh no. However, some patients may be skilled at data analysis due to their profession and may bring both expertise in analysis and bring that nuance of the lived experience. So yes, that's a great comment, Joanne. So yeah, ultimately patients have or patient partners have many skills, many abilities, and it could very likely be that some of your patient partners are statisticians by nature and ultimately can influence that aspect of the research project. In a few slides, we will sort of give the ideal picture of what engagement at various stages can look like, and maybe that can provide some food for thought as we move forward. All right. And so another comment provided by Donna, thank you, Donna, is that the translation phase itself actually would be critical, could be difficult as well, just in terms of the fact that this is the end of the granting period, funds are running out, and there might be a rush in terms of the time that is left over to get things done and move on. So yeah, I think those are critical points. And yeah, so thank you all for your input. And again, if you have any other comments, feel free to send them to me by email, or as we go forward through the session, keep adding them to the discussion panel. So the last sort of discussion question I am going to pose to you all, and hopefully we can have a bit of an open-ended talk about it, is, as a researcher or a patient partner, what could you specifically do to meet some of those challenges that you anticipate when engaging in this idea of patient engagement in the research process? All right. So I'm just walking down through the comments. Jillian, thanks for your input. So you were speaking to the idea of involving patients throughout the process, as opposed to just at various stages or when patient input is needed. And really what that speaks to is the idea of not engaging patients in a tokenistic fashion to just, get that check on your grant application to say that you had worked with patients, had collaborated with patients, but in reality did not really do it in a meaningful way. And then Sophia, you commented on the idea that to facilitate this whole process of patient engagement is that a standardized set of materials or educational curriculum needs to be relayed. And yeah, so I guess we've kind of touched on that before with the idea of having everyone on the same page. And I think that is a challenge. That still is a challenge. We have CIHR had produced their own curriculum, and that has been piloted and run a few times. But some of or I guess all the SPORE networks really are doing something different. And we are exploring opportunities of how these groups can work together and come up with a strategy or a set of curricula that can be generally applied to any research project, any research group. So I think as these SPORE networks gain their footing a bit more, we'll ultimately see that type of collaboration and that type of material being produced and made available to all. All right. Oh my goodness. So you guys are putting in a lot of comments now. That's great. So just in the interest of time, I will try to go through a few. Perhaps we will summarize these and send them out to you all so that you can perhaps reflect on them a bit more. So Sonia, you were saying that perhaps establishing a tome of reference and coming up with a clear plan is critical to fully engage patients. And so yes, that's really crucial, just because it allows expectations and priorities to be clearly set out and to make sure that everyone is at the same page. All right, wonderful. All right, so it looks like we have another hand. So back to you, KBHN. Hi, Doug. Once you're unmuted. Hey. I guess you have yourself muted, Doug. All right, we'll come back to you, Doug.
There we go.
Oh, there you go.
Yeah, I think we were just playing tag with the button there. So I want to reflect on Donna's comment about the translation phase, where that can be a barrier or difficulty. And this is could it be possible that this is where community partners may come into play to act as a liaison between the researcher-patient collaboration to help bring things out a little bit more? Although it's at the end stage of that particular grant per se, the results are the things that will have an impact on the community, whether that's at a clinical group, clinical practice group, or whether that's more at a grassroots level out in the field, where people can take advantage of those results. Although I think that it's a little bit different than publications, but you know, is it possible that these types of things can come into play?
I think that's a great point, Doug. Yes, because ultimately, what the goal of all these exercises are is to create knowledge and put it into the hands of the right people to make wonderful things happen. So I think yes, that inherent to having community partners would be a really crucial step to actually not have those results languish in a published study in some obscure journal, and really have it actually be of importance and have a positive impact on patients throughout the system. All right. So thank you all. That was it was really great to see the comments that you were incorporating, and I wish we had more time. And I think maybe what we should do is, if time ever permits it, we should just have a big discussion session and see how we can hash these things out. But in the interest of time, I guess I should try to wrap things up, as we have a few slides remaining. So. I'm sorry, I have too many menus open. There we go. So you've all just conveyed some feedback or your perspective on where and how patients can be incorporated in the process. And now, really, what I am going to do is just sort of relay an idealized version of where and how patients can be involved in various capacities throughout the process. So yes, these are just here to, I guess, get you to think a bit more critically of where and how patient involvement can be incorporated. So back to our Road to Research infographic. So remember, we had our 3 phases. And so at the preparatory phase, what sort of involvement can patients offer? And of course, this list is not exhaustive, so just keep that in mind. So at the problem identification stage, again, here you can co-develop and collaborate with a team, with researchers and patient partners to explore and develop research topics that are to be considered. And that can then again translate into the grant proposal phase, where their input can inform, where patients can input can inform the areas where they can be more involved, and typically help define what outcome measures would be important to be assessed during the study. And of course, during the design phase, patients can assist in contributing how the study is designed, and what has been really successful in many studies that I have reviewed is that patients can be critically important to helping develop or co-develop the recruitment strategy that ultimately enhances retention rates and increases the number of subjects that are involved in a project. So moving from the preparatory phase to the execution phase, patient partners can, at the start of the study, assist in helping to write patient information forms, where they relay details of the project, what's going to be studied, how it's going to be studied, and ultimately how it is communicated to be more accessible to a lay audience. And again, patient input is critical on reviewing can be critical in reviewing ethics applications and ensuring that what is being proposed would be accepted by the patient population. And here is I guess, the challenging aspect of the research phase in understanding or appreciating how patient engagement can be incorporated at the data collection and analysis phase. But as we mentioned, patient partners can be critical in helping in recruiting subjects for the research study. Patients can be trained to help conduct interviews. And from my understanding, in some of the work that I have explored, these interviews typically can be more comprehensive and enhance the quality of the research that much more if a patient partner is involved in conducting and running the interviews, and perhaps helping score these transcripts that are generated. And thirdly, a key aspect where patients can be involved in is to help develop themes from the data and helping to organize perhaps the message in a way that would translate at the next phase and be that much more comprehensive and hopefully influential. Now, at the translation phase, and again, this was one of those phases that we had identified that might be a bit easier to incorporate patient perspective or patient engagement. Patient partners can be crucial in helping to communicate your findings, either by being self-advocates or promoting work at conferences by joint presentations, or helping to co-author manuscripts. And again, going back to that idea of patients being very effective self-advocates, is to help design the follow-up work and develop patient information sheets of any sort of effective intervention that was developed, so that patients can get a better understanding of perhaps the nature of the new treatment and what all is involved. And lastly, which I guess is a critical part of the research process, is monitoring and evaluating the success of your program. And here, patient partners can be crucial to help researchers in evaluating how the project is continuing, how it is evolving, and the various elements that are playing into it. And ultimately, as well, patients can stay involved with the project over time and address any sort of issues that might come up even after study closeout. So, because patient engagement is a rather nuanced and certainly in Canada a new way of approaching research, what does the published literature say about patient engagement throughout the research process? So when we had sent you the link to receive the login details for today's webinar, we had provided a reference. And that reference asks 4 critical questions, and one of them pertains to patient engagement throughout the research process. All right. Sorry, we just had a question by you, Jill, and we will get back to you at the end. But yeah, so just to quickly touch on what some of the literature says. So the paper that we had circulated to you was published about 4 years ago, and ultimately it reviewed available research studies and aimed at synthesizing the existing evidence about patient engagement in research, with the ultimate goal of helping researchers and networks like ChildBright in designing and conducting meaningful patient engagement throughout that whole process. So through their review, they identified 142 research studies that involve patient engagement. And of these 142 studies, 35 describe patient engagement in the preparatory phase, 90 in the execution phase, and 52 in the translation phase. And ultimately, some of these studies contributed to our understanding of more than one phase. So one thing I just wanted to point out to you was that in the paper, the studies that were reviewed described a variety of methods that were used to engage patients. The most common of these were focus groups, interviews, and surveys, with the most active form of engagement being patients serving on a study or advisory board and attending meetings with researchers. Now, as you look at these results, so I've broken it down into the three phases, and based on the legend on the bottom, you'll see that focus groups and interviews generally were the most widely used engagement tools. But what they found was that in general, engagement was feasible in most settings and most commonly done at the beginning of a research project, and less commonly during the execution and translation of research. And really that, from our sort of informal poll that we had done this morning, that seems to be reflected here as well, where it does seem that the starting phases of a project perhaps is the easiest point to incorporate that perspective, and it trails off at the latter stages due to a variety of barriers and issues that aren't addressed. And so I would definitely recommend that you, if you haven't had a chance to join the previous session we had that explored some of these barriers, I would encourage you to take a look at ChildBright's YouTube page just to look it up and get some additional information on what those barriers look like, and perhaps some strategies that can be employed to overcome them. But in this paper specifically, the most commonly cited challenges were related to logistics. So in terms of the time it takes to engage patient partners, and as Doug had mentioned, the funding that is needed to do research in this way. And a really big issue, which was more predominant from the researchers, is that there is a worry that this type of engagement only is done in a tokenistic manner, where again it's only done to check off a box without actually meaningfully engaging with our partners. So as a throwback to the session we just had at the beginning of July, let's just consider those methods of engagement that they had mentioned in the previous slide and where they fall along those levels of participation that we had defined before. So you may recall that in the previous session, we had described this continuum of participation that ranges from the level of inform all the way to empower. And depending on where the patient partners are engaged on this spectrum, their involvement can have a varied impact on the decision-making process. So in the example that we had just considered, the majority of patient engagement methods, so as the focus group, interview, and survey, fell somewhere between the consult and the involve stage, whereas the more engaged activities where patients were involved on the governance, I guess, committee, where they were a part of the organizational structure of the project, that sat at a much higher level of on this decision-making impact on decision-making process continuum. So as we can see, it seems like it is easier to engage patients at a lower level than it is at a more difficult level. I mean, you can see that reflected in our previous bar graph here. So moving forward, so when we revisit these findings, when we revisit these findings from the view, we again notice that one, the engagement was typically done at the start of a project and involved methods that were primarily at the lower end of the participation spectrum. And I point this out not to be discouraging, but to reinforce that this way of doing research represents a significant shift that will take time to gain traction. And ultimately, this requires a continued commitment from all stakeholder groups to continue building that momentum and show the benefits of approaching research in this fashion. So how do we forge ahead and more effectively incorporate patient engagement in in a research project. And as we've sort of teased through some of the discussions and comments that were shared, this is an incredibly complex and challenging area to address, which is influenced by a number of contextual issues, such as the funding issues we were talking about today, what particular patient population is being served. And in my opinion, recommendations for best practices will likely evolve over time as we see enhanced buy-in to this idea of doing research in a manner that engages patients more as partners. So what we consider in the next two slides are just a few brief tips that should help start your exploration of this idea of having patients being meaningfully and actively engaged throughout the process. And ultimately, this is quite brief and then quite a big picture overview. So what we'll make sure that in the post-webinar correspondence we send out, hopefully by tomorrow, that includes the slide deck and a link to the recording. We'll also include a few additional resources that sort of provide a framework and explore this in more detail that you can work through at your own convenience. So fundamental to patient-oriented research is the challenge to foster a climate where all members of a team contribute their experience and expertise to achieve a common goal. Anecdotally, I think we all recognize that researchers and trainees and patient partners each possess complementary skills, background, and experiences that, when brought together, can act in a synergistic way and make the whole better than the sum of its parts. Now, this idea of partnership ultimately then denotes the pooling of resources, of acknowledging value in order to achieve a common goal that is of equal importance to all, I guess, that is common to all partners. And really, how do we get started towards this partnership? First is to consider shared values. For the partnership to be effective, it really is crucial that all team members are on the same page in that their inherent values line up. So this can include the motivation that drives the research project, or even a view to the eventual impact that the work may have. The second aspect that is crucial to effective partnership is this idea of mutual accountability and interdependence. And so as a partnership, all team members equally share in the risks and rewards of the project. And really what this comes down to is that the research process itself is more democratized and team members depend on and keep each other accountable. And thirdly, a crucial part to establishing this effective partnership is acknowledging the expertise of all team members. And again, touching on the idea that incorporating various perspectives strengthens the overall research project, it is critical that all team members genuinely acknowledge the expertise of those at the table and understand how their perspective can enhance the overall quality of the work. So what sort of practical tips can I offer you as we close out here? So start early, start patient engagement processes early. At the start of your project, when you are identifying your priorities or coming up with perhaps the research objectives, incorporate the patient voice at that stage. Actively build reciprocal relationships. Don't just engage with patient partners in a manner that is primarily tokenistic. And something I guess we've touched on through the session before is that we need to establish resources that more effectively brings everyone to the same page, and have training and resources available for both patients and researchers on how to more effectively work together. And lastly, is this idea of clarifying roles and responsibilities. So at the outset, be clear about what is required, what it's going to look like, and that way start building that effective relationship. So again, if you have any comments or any follow-up, please feel free to send me an email or give me a call, and we'll be happy to connect with you at that point. And so just before we close things off, we have a few moments for questions, and I believe we had one from Jill. So let me just pull it up really quickly. I apologize. We have too many screens open over here. All right. So Joel, a specific question you asked was in relation to how patients can be involved in the design phase of a project. And so what we were getting at there was that patients can be critical to set up the objectives, set up the sort of research agenda for getting things organized, and ultimately aiding in coming up with the grant proposal, or helping further down that process of helping recruit patients and getting the project set up. So if do we have any other questions? No. All right. So I will try to we'll try to respond to some of the questions here by email in the note that will go out later today or tomorrow. But just to close things off, is some next steps for you to consider. Again, as I mentioned in that email we'll send out tomorrow, we will have a survey included to get some of your input on what your perspective was from the session, what we could do better, and ideally, if you can relay any sort of training needs that you would have, that would be great in helping the Child Rights Training Program sort of reassess and move forward. So if you haven't signed up yet, we have a upcoming webinar in about 2 weeks. And this is really great because we will be featuring a project from ChildBright and sort of use this as a case study to explore how patient engagement was incorporated in their project and sort of how that has played out and what that looks like for them, and hopefully get a sense of the lessons learned and strategies moving forward. And just as a reminder, we record these sessions and make the slides available. So if you ever need to get access, they will be on ChildBright's YouTube channel. But if you have trouble finding it, feel free to send me an email. I'll be happy to get that link out to you. All right. So thank you so much for your patience all. That brings us to the end of today's session. I want to thank you again for joining and contributing to some of the discussions that we were having today. Hopefully we see you at the next session, and yeah, we'll connect by email tomorrow. Take care.